Timothy Alberino is the best-selling author of Birthright. He has recently written the introduction and commentary to a compendium on the books of Enoch. He's been living, working, and researching in Peru for well over a decade, and he's very interested in the UFO phenomenon, its ancient roots, and how it is playing out in the modern society today.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, welcome back, Timothy, to Exopolitics Today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me back.
I know you just came out with this compendium on the 3 books of Enoch. So for people that maybe don't know and who think that there's just the 1 book of Enoch, can you just give people a brief summary of what these 3 books of Enoch are?
Sure. The 3 books of Enoch are of course First Enoch, which is otherwise known as the Ethiopic Enoch, Second Enoch, otherwise known as the Slavonic Enoch, and Third Enoch, otherwise known as the Hebrew Enoch. A Slavonic Enoch is also called the Book of the Secrets of Enoch, and the Hebrew Enoch is also called the Revelation of Metatron. They're very different. These 3 books are quite different in content, especially First Enoch distinguishes itself from Second and Third Enoch, which are a little bit similar, Second and Third Enoch, but First Enoch is quite different. First Enoch, the Ethiopic Enoch, and we say the Ethiopic Enoch because First Enoch was lost to the world after the 5th century. It was in wide circulation before the 5th century, and then after the 5th century, it disappeared from the scriptoriums of Europe, and it would have been lost forever had it not been conserved among the Ethiopians. And specifically, it was the Ethiopian Tawahedo Orthodox Christians and the Beta Israel Jews, both of whom preserved the Book of Enoch and indeed inducted it into their canon. And it is from Ethiopia that the Book of Enoch was brought back into scholarship, into the corpus of scholarship of the West. It was written, the original copy in Enoch, the copy that was brought back from Ethiopia was written in Ge'ez, the liturgical language of Ethiopia, and then fragments of First Enoch were discovered, Greek fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Book of Enoch, First Enoch, the Ethiopic Enoch, was the earliest portions of it were certainly written before the birth of Christ. It's dated from at least 300 BC, the oldest portions, whereas Second Enoch and Third Enoch were most likely written, certainly Third Enoch, written after the birth of Christ, dated somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, generally speaking. There is some contention in regard to the dating of all 3 of these manuscripts. No one knows for sure, but we can say with a great deal of confidence that Second and Third Enoch were written after the birth of Christ, post Anno Domini. The content of First Enoch, as I said earlier, distinguishes itself from Second and Third Enoch in that it is a historical narrative, a narrative which actually underlies much of the Old and indeed New Testament of the Bible. Which may come as a surprise to many listeners because obviously the Book of Enoch in any form is not found within the canonized Old Testament and is not a part of the New Testament. And so it is, as I said, quite surprising for some people to realize that the Book of Enoch is indeed referenced, in fact, quoted verbatim in the New Testament, First Enoch. When I say the Book of Enoch, we're talking about First Enoch here. And as I said, underlies it forms the substrate of so much of the cosmology that is apparent in the Old Testament. So it's a very, very important manuscript. It was considered First Enoch, specifically the first section of First Enoch, which is called the Book of the Watchers, was considered as was considered to be veritable history by the ancient Hebrews, which is quite intriguing because I think, as we've discussed on your show before, the story that's related in First Enoch is the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim giants who were progenerated through the Watchers, through the procreative action of the Watchers with human women. So it's a very intriguing story, very important story. And Second Enoch is much more. Second Enoch and Third Enoch are clearly the product of what's called Merkaba mysticism. It's Jewish mysticism, sometimes called chariot or throne room mysticism, and it's all very mystical. And Second and Third Enoch, especially Third Enoch, it's highly esoteric content, and it doesn't have the same narrative qualities as First Enoch. And also, I would say that First Enoch also distinguishes itself from Second and Third Enoch in that it contains a lot of Christological content, messianic content in the forms of the oracles, specifically in the parables, which are remarkable when considering that they were written before the birth of Christ and predict with such great accuracy the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth.
Now, with the Book of Enoch, or Enoch 1 and Enoch 2, that they ostensibly derive from events that happened before the Great Flood. So that raises the question of, okay, so you have this Great Flood event, then society kind of like goes through millennia of regrouping, rebuilding, and whatever happened with the events that happened in the Book of Enoch, they were recorded or passed down orally, and then at some point they were transcribed, I guess, or that transition from the oral tradition to the textual tradition somewhere around the 300 or BC. So you want to maybe kind of walk us through how that would have happened? How would the Book of Enoch, if it traces back to the deluge, can have been preserved all this time?
It's probably more accurate to describe the dating of First Enoch as being compiled around 300 BC, because we should probably differentiate between the older portions of First Enoch, namely the Book of the Watchers and the parables, and the latter sections, which are comprised of the book of the courses of the heavenly luminaries, the dream visions, the concluding section, the fragments from the Book of Noah. There are fragments from the Book of Noah contained within the Book of Enoch as well. So I would say that the First Enoch, the Ethiopic Enoch that we have today, was compiled sometime probably around 300 BC. But that's not to say that it was written sometime around 300 BC. I think that the earliest portions of Enoch are indeed very, very ancient. I would go so far as to say that they are antediluvian, that they pre-exist, they were in existence in the world before the great cataclysm, namely the flood of Noah. And indeed may even represent some original manuscript, perhaps even written by the hand of Noah. Now, this, of course, is a preposterous notion to conventional anthropology and archaeology. The notion that there was a form of writing in existence before the flood of Noah in the antediluvian world, that, as I said, would not at all be affirmed by modern anthropologists. But I nevertheless hold that view. Enoch is called a scribe. Indeed, he was considered the greatest scribe and prophet among the Jews. The Hebrews considered Enoch to be their greatest scribe and prophet. And what do scribes do if not write? And I believe that there was a written tradition from Enoch that was conserved through the family line and was preserved on with Noah through the flood. And so I would contend that some sort of written manuscript, not exactly what we have today in First Enoch, but elements of First Enoch, have existed in the world for thousands of years, and indeed predate not only the Hebrews themselves, but also predate the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Akkadians, and the Sumerians, and indeed the Proto-Sumerians. I would say that it may actually represent, the Book of Enoch could actually represent the oldest manuscript ever penned by the hand of a human being, or one of the oldest manuscripts. Now, it's also possible that there was in existence a manuscript from the antediluvian world penned by Enoch himself that was lost to us at some point in the course of history, and was carried on in the form of oral tradition, as you suggested, and that oral tradition was at some point committed to writing, and was appeared in the world as Enoch at some point in the distant past. I would further contend that were we to travel back in time and visit Judea in the 1st century AD, we would discover a scroll in the scriptoriums of the synagogues in Judea. We would discover a scroll that contained portions of what we call today First Enoch. So I think it is a very ancient document. I think it predates the Hebrews, indeed predates the Sumerians, is antediluvian. At least the oral tradition is antediluvian, and it forms the substrate not only of so much of the content in the biblical narrative, but indeed is the origin story of the Sumerian flood myth, rather than the other way around, rather than the Hebrew account being a product of plagiarization from or a polemic over and against the Sumerian account. Rather, the Sumerian account is in fact based on the oldest traditions of mankind, the antediluvian traditions, which we call today the Book of Enoch.
Well, of course, that's very controversial, and I'm sure a lot of Sumerian scholars would jump up and down
Certainly.
and challenge that. But before we kind of address that, I think that there's a very important supporting text, and that's part of the compendium, which is the Slavonic Book of Enoch, Book 2, where it talks about how Enoch actually transcribed his experiences in the heavens and wrote 366 texts or books, and that he gave responsibility for protecting those books and preserving them and releasing them to the rest of humanity to his son Methuselah, who then handed it off. So I think,
who's the father of Noah, or rather the father of Lamech, who's the father of Noah, the grandfather.
So right there, you actually have support for this idea that not just the Book of Enoch, but there might be many books written by Enoch that were preserved in some way by the descendants that somehow did it, whether through secret societies, Order of Melchizedek, whatever it is. So
that's right.
You want to elaborate on that?
No, I think that's true, and as you said, Sumerian scholars, their heads would explode right now, because the popular contention, very popular contention, is that all of the Hebrew traditions, what they refer to as the Hebrew mythology, is in fact derived, or rather plagiarized, from the Sumerians, who predate the Hebrews. And there's no question, obviously the Sumerians predate the Hebrews. That's not in dispute. Abraham came from the land of Ur, which was in Sumeria or Arcadia, depending on Ur of the Chaldeans, which might have been in lower or upper Mesopotamia. And so Hebrew culture sprouted from the larger Mesopotamian context. It is Mesopotamian at its roots, although very peculiar in many of its idiosyncrasies. It is nevertheless a Mesopotamian culture. And indeed, we could say the same thing of the ancient Egyptians, who are fundamentally also a Mesopotamian culture, at least share a lot of commonality with especially the Sumerians. And so the prevailing notion is this is the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Sumerians are the earliest civilizations that we know of that had a system of writing, that were advanced cultures, And therefore, all of the other mythologies that arose in the ancient Near East were an offshoot, a product of those cultures, specifically the Sumerians, and that before the Sumerians, that these traditions of the flood, the Sumerian flood myth, for example, were non-existent. That the Sumerians invented them, and I simply think that that's a fallacy. I think that the Sumerians were drawing upon a tradition that predates them. A written tradition, certainly an oral tradition, but again, I contend a written tradition, and that makes the anthropologist's head spin. That I would say something, that I would deign to say something so absurd, so outrageous, to suggest that there was an advanced civilization inhabiting the earth pre-cataclysm, before the Noahic flood. But I absolutely believe that there was. In fact, I believe that the people who inhabited the world before the flood of Noah, or the great cataclysm, however you would have it, were much more remarkable than we are in regard to their physical and intellectual capacities. They were physically more robust than we are. They lived much longer than we do, and they were far more intelligent than we are. Not less intelligent, not apes. We're not descending into a world of apish Neanderthals when we go into the antediluvian world. That certainly was not the perspective of the ancients. That was not the perspective of the ancient Egyptians, for example, and not just the ancient Egyptians. Of every major ancient civilization believed that the antediluvians were vastly superior to themselves, and that they were recovering and reinstituting the knowledge that was lost in the cataclysm. This is what the ancients believed all over the world, by the way, but especially in the Fertile Crescent. This was certainly the tradition of the Mesopotamians at large, was that the antediluvians were more remarkable than they were. And so that would suggest that there were traditions, written and oral traditions, that came through the cataclysm. If you subscribe to the biblical narrative, then that would be through Noah. If you subscribe to the Sumerian flood myth, then that would be Utnapishtim. And those form, that's the nucleus, those are the roots, the origin of all other flood myth stories that emerged in Mesopotamia. And so from that view, if the biblical narrative is true, and indeed Enoch was a scribe and wrote some manuscript or manuscripts, and those manuscripts or oral traditions made it through the flood, then those stories are the foundation of the Mesopotamian myth. And indeed, I would say that the Mesopotamian myth, from my perspective, is a corruption of the antediluvian mythos regarding the Watchers and the giants and the flood of Noah, rather than the Hebrew narrative being a plagiarization of the Sumerian myth. I would say the Sumerian myth is a corruption of the Noahic tradition, the Enochian tradition. And the reason why I say that is because if you're versed in the biblical narrative, you encounter early on, after the flood, you encounter a character called Nimrod. And according to the biblical narrative, after the flood, God he commanded that the descendants of Noah disperse, that they multiply, fill the earth. So it was a command to disperse, and in direct defiance of this mandate from heaven, according to the Bible, the people did the exact opposite. They came together and they consolidated in the plains of Shinar, and they built a city called Babel. And within this city, they raised a tower called the Tower of Babel. And I believe that this enterprise was masterminded by this character called Nimrod, that he was the instigator. Why do I say that? Because the name Nimrod means we will rebel. And so, and it's important to understand that according to the biblical narrative, the sons of Noah were still alive when this undertaking when the building of Babel and the Tower of Babel are underway, and probably would have objected because it was in direct defiance to the mandate of God. And so you have this open defiance, this moment of rebellion, this situation in which Nimrod is leading the offspring of Noah into rebellion, consolidating in the plains of Shinar, and instituting, in my opinion, a new religion, a new cult, the cult of Nimrod, from which by the way is a aberration of the tradition, the Noahic and the Enochian tradition. It is to some extent a bastardization of those traditions and an inversion of those traditions and a creation of a new mythos, a creation of a new cult, the cult of Nimrod, which itself becomes the foundation. That you might consider that as the Proto-Sumerian, a Proto-Akkadian civilization that itself becomes the foundation for what would ultimately manifest as the Sumerian cult, and the Sumerian flood myth. So in other words, from my perspective, we're looking at the antediluvian tradition, perhaps even the manuscripts coming through the flood, through Noah, and then a rebellion happening and a willful distortion and inversion of the stories. So modern scholarship today views the Book of Enoch as a polemic against the gods of the Mesopotamians, of Akkad, of Sumer, and that it was plagiarization to some extent, but it's a polemic. It's an invented mythology. So that in their perspective, the Hebrews are taking the stories of the Mesopotamians, they're inverting them, and they're using it as they're employing it as a polemic against the gods of Mesopotamia and against the cult, the cult of Mesopotamia. When in fact I see the opposite happening. I see the Nimrod and the Proto-Sumerian civilization, or the Proto-Akkadian civilization, intentionally distorting the traditions that predate them, that come from the antediluvian world, in an act of insubordination and defiance, and that becoming the plagiarization, if we want to use that term, the distortion of the original story. So these are two conflicting views. I, of course, am in the minority, as you rightly said. Assyriologists would roll their eyes at such a preposterous proposition, but I nevertheless believe it is true.
Well, this is fascinating. So many issues come up now. In terms of what happened just prior to the flood, maybe it'd be worthwhile you just kind of like explaining, prior to the flood, explaining this world that Jared and Enoch lived in that kind of led to the events of the flood. Are we talking about something that happened around 9,600 BC at the end of the Younger Dryas?
I would say so.
Okay.
That would be my opinion. Now, of course, I don't know for sure. And a lot of most Christians would assume that the flood happened probably sometime around 3,300 BC. I used to be of that opinion, but I've come across some new data that I think supports a much older date for the great cataclysm that all of these primary cultures around the world have recorded, either in written form or oral tradition. The flood myths all around the world. I think that is a real event. It's not invented. It's not imagined. They're all documenting some tremendously catastrophic event that rocked the earth in the distant past. And I'm persuaded that we are talking about something like the Younger Dryas impact event, and that we're looking somewhere around 10,000 BC, probably, in my estimation, of the dating of that event, which would have affected the entire Earth, which would have been absolutely catastrophic, especially if you were living on the coastal areas. You would have experienced mile-high tidal waves and catastrophic flooding if you lived on the banks of rivers and in the coastal regions, which is where most of humanity was located. So Yeah, that would be my estimation of the time frame, somewhere around 10,000 BC, somewhere thereabouts.
I just
Now,
want to point out something here, because that date is significant, because Plato talked about that date as
that's
also
right.
being the collapse of Atlantis, and talked about Atlantis being this technologically advanced state that went to war against other regions, including Greece. And so, are those the events that Jared and Enoch were describing?
I do believe they were. I think we're talking about, clearly, we're talking about the antediluvian world. And it was, of course, Graham Hancock has popularized all of this, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and Randall Carlson and others as well. And I think that when we talk about the myth of Atlantis, the legend of Atlantis, I think Atlantis is an allegory, actually, of the antediluvian age. And this story, this narrative of the antediluvian world, comes from several sources. The Egyptians had their mythos. The Sumerians and that culture, the Babylonians, had their mythos. And of course, the Hebrews had their mythos. And they're all very congruent in many interesting ways. So these stories are, as everyone I'm sure knows, are very, very similar. And the general notion, the general framework of this story is something like this. At some point in the distant past, there was this golden age in which the gods descended from heaven and co-inhabited the earth with mankind. Indeed, not only did they co-inhabit the earth with mankind, they copulated with human women, and they procreated with these women a race of hybrid demigods, and that these hybrid demigods ruled the earth for a period of time. The ancient Egyptians call this period of time Zep Tepi, the first time. And then all of this precipitated a great flood, a cataclysm, which brought to ruin the old world, the empire of the gods, as I call it. That general framework is, and I would also add that, and somebody was preserved, a portion of humanity, a very small portion of humanity, according to the Hebrew account, 8 souls survived the flood. Of course, Noah and his family. And in the Sumerian account, it would be Itnapishtim, I just totally forgot how to pronounce his name. The equivalent, I'm sorry? Utnapishtim, thank you. Utnapishtim survived the flood. It's kind of a difficult name to pronounce, and it was very similar to the situation with Noah. I don't remember if the Egyptian count. I know the Egyptian count has survivors of the cataclysm, but I don't recall in what context. But of course, we all are familiar with the fact that the Hebrew account and the Sumerian account involve an ark of some sort and animals, which is there's a lot of similarity there, and the idea of an ark as well is found in the Egyptian mythos. So, in fact, this story is kind of encapsulated in the myth of the Osirian myth, the myth of Osiris, in which Osiris is. His body is sealed up in a coffin by Set, his brother, and that coffin is thrown into the Nile, and it makes its way to the shores of Byblos, and there's this whole narrative, this Osirian narrative, which I think is all very symbolic of the antediluvian world and the knowledge that was preserved through the antediluvian world, primarily among the Phoenicians. And this, of course, formulates the beginning, the foundation of the Freemasonry, of the Masonic order, and of other secret societies as well. So that's the general framework of the antediluvian world, of this Mesopotamian mythos, the flood mythos that you find all over the world. And again, it involves the gods descending, cohabiting among mankind, progenerating a race of hybrid demigods with human women, and ruling the earth in some capacity. And that this, in most versions, this is seen in through a very laudatory prism. In other words, this is a golden age of peace and prosperity. But in stark contrast to these other mythologies, flood mythologies, The Hebrew account sees this golden age as a dystopia. It sees it as a time of great bloodshed, in which the demigods were enforcing this tyranny, and indeed consuming human beings. They were cannibalizing human beings and oppressing mankind, and there was a great conflict, and this hybrid civil war breaks out, which is apparent in the Book of Enoch, and it's quite a different story in regard to that perspective. Most of the flood myths will view the antediluvian world and this incident of the gods commingling with mankind as this wonderful thing that resulted in a time of peace and prosperity. The Hebrews see the opposite. The Hebrews will view it as this terrible thing that the knowledge of the Watchers, for example, corrupted mankind, rather than, like in the Sumerian account, the 7 sages, the Apkallu, were the civilizing gods, and they bestowed mankind with the arts of civilization. Well, in the Hebrew account, the Watchers did indeed exchange knowledge with mankind. It was an exchange; it was a bargain, because in exchange for the knowledge, they were wed to the daughters of, probably in the line of Cain. So it was an exchange; it was a bargain. They, in exchange for the hands of these maidens in marriage, they gave mankind knowledge. The Book of Enoch says knowledge that these men were already striving to learn, and that knowledge ended up corrupting mankind and leading to all kinds of havoc on earth, and ultimately precipitating the flood. So many details are the same. The perspective is quite different from the Hebrew perspective and that of the other Mesopotamian flood myths, namely the Sumerian and the ancient Egyptian flood myth. But the figure of Utnapishtim and Noah are very similar figures. It's almost, really the similarities there are obvious, very apparent. And so those two myths are the most alike, certainly.
Enoch, it seems to me to be very similar to modern contactee stories. You're talking about people being taken up into the heavens and having these interactions with different angels or different beings and getting a lot of information and bringing that back to the earth. So to me, I would say that's very similar to contactees. You can go back to the famous George Adamski. I mean, he describes something very, very similar. So is that what the Book of Enoch is really all about? Like ancient contactees having these experiences?
Well, I would say it's more than contactees. I would say it's much more direct than that. We're talking about the appearance of a superior non-human race among mankind, who integrates with mankind quite literally, who, as I said, who copulates with human women and produces hybrid race of beings, who the Bible calls the Nephilim and describes as giants. And again, in the Sumerian text, it would be the Apkallu, the 7 sages, and so forth. So it's much more direct than just sort of an influence. It's not just an influence or some sort of a distant contact with extraterrestrial beings. These beings are here. They're co-inhabiting the earth with mankind. They're building a hybrid empire, an empire of the gods, if you will, on earth. And so I think it's much more direct. It's direct contact. This is what the ancients say. This is the story that they all relate. And again, this is known as the Golden Age, or Zeptepi, the first time when the gods cohabited with mankind. So I think it's quite unique in the annals of history. And of course, it was all brought to an abrupt end in the cataclysm. And what's really interesting is when you compare First Enoch, the Ethiopic Enoch, the story from the Book of the Watchers, which I just sort of framed, the Watchers descending and doing everything that they did. And then you take Plato's Legend of Atlantis, and there's a one-to-one correspondence here, because Plato begins talking about the story of Atlantis. Of course, he's doing this through the priest of Sais, who are interfacing with Solon in Plato's dialogue, the Critias dialogue. And what the priests of Sais describe is I would say is, as I said, it's synchronistic with what's recorded in Enoch, namely that the gods apportion the earth. He says the gods apportion the earth among themselves, and in other words, they each had an allotment. They divided the earth among themselves, the governance of the earth among themselves, the rulership of the earth. And then he proceeds to describe what they did after they apportioned the earth among themselves. And he's specific, because he's talking about Atlantis, to the god Poseidon. So the story shifts to Poseidon and what specifically Poseidon did. So Poseidon took his allotment, which was called which he called Atlantis, and he raised this island, and he constructed this great city on the island, the city of Atlantis. But what did he do? Poseidon became enamored of a human woman, and he wed her. He married her. He copulated with her, and she gave birth to 5 sets of hybrid twins, the sons of Poseidon, the chief of whom was Atlas. And these 5 twins, hybrid twins, these demigods, became the 10 kings of Atlantis, right? And I think we can extrapolate that the other gods did the same thing. In fact, we know that the other Greek gods were fond of the males in the pantheon, were fond of human women, and indeed engaged in much procreation, let's say, with them. So it's apparent that the other gods did the same. And indeed, we find that we have intimations of this in the story. So there are some ancient texts. Helena Blavatsky references some of these ancient Sanskrit texts, which also relate the story of Atlantis in similar terms, except for they add an interesting detail. They say that the hybrid sons of Poseidon, and I think his wife was named Plato, were giants. And indeed, again, intimations of this can be found in Greek mythology, because Atlantis, the way that Atlantis is described, does paint him as a giant. But we know that some of the offspring of the gods were giants and cyclopes. So, the 10 kings of Poseidon, the 10 sons of Poseidon, these hybrid kings who are ruling over Atlantis, they engage in this expansionary campaign, this aggressive campaign in which they're beginning to build, they're expanding the borders of their kingdom. They're going to war with other nations. And the only nation, they're steamrolling all of these other kingdoms. And the only kingdom that can withstand them are the Athenians. This is what the priests of Sais are explaining to Solon, are relating to Solon. And telling Solon how great his antecedents were, and he doesn't really understand this story, and he doesn't understand how remarkable his antecedents were, namely the Athenians. And the Athenians had their patron deity, Athena, and so the Athenians were resisting the Atlanteans in this conflict, which I think represents a hybrid civil war. The sons of Poseidon are going to war with probably, I think we can assume, the hybrid offspring of the god of Athens. And in the midst of this conflict, a great cataclysm ensues. And this, of course, is the destruction of Atlantis in a day and a night, Atlantis being consumed in an aqueous cataclysm. But not just Atlantis, everybody gets destroyed in the cataclysm. This is what the Egyptians are relating to Solon. Again, the priests of Sais. And so that story that Plato tells in the Critias dialogue is congruent with the story of the Watchers in the Book of Enoch. It's pretty much the same story. And I find it remarkable that across many different continents, among many different ancient cultures, you find the seeds of the same exact story with many of those same elements, namely the gods, their offspring, this kingdom, this factional, fratricidal conflict that happens, and the flood that ensues.
Well, one of the
Or the
things that
cataclysm.
Well, one of the things that's always puzzled me is that in the Book of Enoch and in the Genesis chapter 6, it describes how the watchers or the fallen angels interbred with the daughters of man to breed these giants called the Nephilim. And of course, well, how can a human woman, 5 feet tall, give birth to a giant, or birth a giant that's maybe 15, 20, 30 feet, whatever it is? So is that plausible, or is there another explanation, that is that the extraterrestrials, the fallen angels, actually conducted genetic experiments on the humans of the time, and they created these giants from these genetic experiments?
Well, according to the biblical account, and I would say to the Dead Sea, to what's attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, namely the Book of Enoch, what I call the first cause of the Watchers' transgression is lust. They lusted after the daughters of men. So the initial impulse was sexual. It was a sexual impulse. They desired to copulate with these women within the covenant of marriage, which is very, very intriguing. I have a lot to say about that in my book, Birthright. So but the important point here is that they're lusting. So, they're not going to fulfill this desire of theirs to have sexual relations with these women. That desire is not going to be fulfilled in a petri dish. They are copulating in fact, in all of these ancient mythologies, these pre-flood mythologies, the gods are copulating with human women. So I would say that the progeneration of the giants, of the Nephilim, was the result of procreation, of copulation between the gods, the watchers, and the human women. Now, in regard to how those women could carry and to term and give birth to these offspring, well, one solution to this problem is that it would have been very much like babies who are born today with gigantism, where their size and weight at birth is typical, but as they progress through adolescence, they have an accelerated growth rate. Now, in the case of gigantism, it's a pituitary abnormality, but in the case of the offspring of the gods, these hybrid beings, it would be a genetic trigger. It would be some sort of a growth spurt. As they're growing through adolescence, instead of reaching a stature that might have been typical at the time, 5.5 feet, they continued. Their growth was accelerated. And by the time they were adults, they were much, much larger than that. And I do not believe, by the way, that the giants were, as the Book of Enoch records, 300 ells, which amounts to skyscrapers and beyond. I think that's a corruption. It's not found in some of the Greek fragments. It is in the Ethiopic manuscript, but I think it's a corruption or an addition or an amendment to the original text. And by the way, the original version of First Enoch was probably written in Aramaic or Hebrew. So and it's clear to us that there was a manuscript of First Enoch that was in circulation, at least in the early church age, so from the 1st to the 3rd centuries AD, that was very similar to the Ethiopic text, but was also different because some of the early church fathers quote from a manuscript that is different than the one we have today, because the quotations that they cite are not in the Ethiopic version. So there was another ancient manuscript called the Book of Enoch, or a manuscript that was attributed to Enoch, in circulation, certainly in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries AD.
One of the chief characters in the Book of Enoch is the Ancient of Days, and he's depicted as kind of like a god, a more powerful figure presiding over these different angelic orders. Now, when I read that, what I look at it through a kind of exopolitical lens, and what I see is something like what the Sumerians described, or in the Anunnaki texts about the Anunnaki. Like you have someone like Anu, the supreme commander, presiding over an assembly of his peers, and that they actually make all these decisions over the future of humanity. And so was Enoch taken up to be before this kind of like Ancient of Days, who was like this transcendent God presiding over angels, or was it like an extraterrestrial high commander surrounded by his peers to make these decisions affecting the future of humanity?
Well, in the book of Enoch, Enoch actually is never taken to heaven. Enoch has dreams and visions about heaven, heavenly dreams and visions. And I think this is a misconception that Enoch actually went up to heaven and saw things. He's actually, if you read First Enoch, you find, and I'm speaking within the context of First Enoch here, disregarding second and third for now. Enoch actually, the first encounter he has, because remember in the book of Enoch, what you have is a very interesting situation. You have these renegade watchers, these watcher beings, these angelic beings who are on the earth, and then you have these other watcher entities who are in heaven or the kingdom of heaven, who are presiding in judgment over their brethren. So it's to simplify it, it's good watchers who are in heaven, so to speak, and the bad watchers on earth. And the good watchers are presiding in judgment over the bad watchers, and Enoch is operating as the intermediary between the two. And what happens is Enoch, most of the communication between the good watchers and Enoch occurs in the context of a dream or a series of dreams. So Enoch is asleep by the River Dan, on the shores of the River Dan, and he is dreaming, and he's getting a download of information, communication from the good watchers to be delivered to the bad watchers. And so he's functioning in this very interesting intermediary capacity, which happens, by the way, in the biblical account as well. There's a very similar account in the book of Daniel where the good watchers, because the term watcher is a biblical term. It's found in the book of Daniel. It's the same sort of situation, except the good watchers are presiding in judgment over a human king, Nebuchadnezzar, and it's Daniel who's the intermediary between the two. So it's very interesting scenario that's mirrored in Daniel from Enoch. And so Enoch is again, he's receiving a communication through dreams and visions that he's delivering to the watcher. So he's actually interfacing directly with the renegade watchers on earth and indirectly with the as the book of Enoch calls them, the holy watchers in heaven. He's never actually, it's not apparent in the text that he's ever actually anywhere but on planet Earth during the course of this interaction. Although he does have many heavenly visions and visionary experiences that he's conveying to the renegade watchers on earth, the apostate sons of God on earth. So I would say that, and you are touching on something that's very important here, and this is another similarity between the Mesopotamian religion and the religion of the Hebrews, in that both of these traditions conceptualize a scenario in which there is a great king, a great God, who is surrounded by a council. So there's this divine king who is accompanied by a council, and the king and his council deliberate over the affairs of mankind. And it's interesting because it's actually this deliberation is in among the Mesopotamians is thought to occur on the summit of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon, which is known as the Mountain of Oath, directly related to the Watchers narrative, by the way. It was upon the summit of Mount Hermon that the Watchers descended So you have the ancient Mesopotamians conceptualizing, because of course they can see Hermon. It's the highest summit. They can see Hermon, or one of the highest summits, and it's covered in snow, and they are envisioning the gods holding court on the summit of Hermon, so that the supreme deity and the lesser divine beings around him, his council, holding court, deliberating matters pertaining to mankind. Well, this same idea, and the late Dr. Heiser calls this the divine council paradigm. This same idea is apparent in the biblical text. You have God, you have a supreme being, the King of Heaven, okay, who in the biblical narrative is actually the Son of God. He's the King of the council. He is the King of Heaven. He has a council. He has a divine council, and they deliberate matters pertaining to mankind, just like just like in the Mesopotamian paradigm. And indeed, this is why we see, for example, in the beginning of Genesis, at the inception of mankind, when the decision is being made to create mankind, you have this declaration, this corporate declaration: let us create man in our image and likeness, and let him have dominion over the earth. This is not a conversation as is popularly conceived in conventional theology. This is not a conversation between the Godhead, the Trinity. This is a declaration that's coming from the King and his council collectively. They deliberated the matter to create mankind, and then the decision came forth, and the pronouncement was, let us collectively create mankind in our image. And I think, the prerogative of creating was always, the prerogative is the king's. In other words, he's the maker, but he and his council deliberated the matter, and then executed the plan, which was to create mankind and give him dominion of the earth. So you are touching on something that I think is very intriguing and important, this divine council paradigm that is clearly present in the Mesopotamian cults and also in the biblical, in the Hebraic tradition.
The story of Noah and the ark is a key part of the whole Book of Enoch saga. Now, the ark itself, I mean, in current biblical texts, traditions, it's described as this kind of wooden boat, but we know from what we discussed that kind of pre-flood culture was quite advanced in terms of metallurgy. They had a sophisticated understanding of advanced technologies. You look at, say, the Atlantean, Egyptian kind of technology that is depicted in places like Abydos. You have like the Abydos glyph with the helicopters and the submarines and so forth. So was Noah's Ark a wooden boat, or was it actually something much more sophisticated?
It might have been something much more sophisticated, but in the biblical narrative, the boat is said to have been made of gopher wood. Indeed, Noah was directed by God to build the ark of gopher wood, and gopher wood has been variously identified as cypress, cedar, pine. No one really knows what gopher wood was, but again, according to the biblical account, the boat was made of wood. But that's, who knows? Who knows what sort of engineering was employed in this vessel? I think in this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the Sumerian account it was a box. It was like a rectangle. I think it was a rectangle made of wood. Both in Noah's case and Utnapishtim's case, it was designed to house a human family and animals. And the idea is the preservation of life through the cataclysm and into the antediluvian world. But there may be something very, perhaps the dimensions of the boat, the description of the boat in the Genesis account, because actually what's interesting is that the Enochian tale, the story told in First Enoch, actually doesn't detail the flood. It sort of ends after the judgment of the Watchers and their offspring, the Nephilim. We never actually get to the flood. The flood is intimated that we know the flood is coming because of it's part of the judgment, but the story is actually never completed. We find the completion of that story in the book of Genesis. And according to Genesis, Noah was instructed, and there's other, by the way, extra biblical texts, some Dead Sea Scrolls material as well, that describes some other details. For example, one of the scrolls describes, you might find this interesting, Noah being aided by angelic beings in the construction of the boat, in the construction of the ark. I believe that's material from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's certainly, I think it comes from Second Temple, the Second Temple tradition at the very least, but I'm pretty sure it comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The idea that that Noah was actually assisted in the building of this craft that was going to make it through the cataclysm by angelic entities. If that's the case, then who knows? I mean, we could be looking at some sort of, rather than just a wooden boat floating on water, we could be looking at something much more technological, much more interesting. It's certainly in its potential, its capacity to house genetic material and a more sophisticated situation maybe than just a bunch of animals in pens on a wooden boat, right? I would be certainly open to that idea.
And of course, that has reference to prophetic predictions of the coming of Jesus. Now, I wonder whether or not this kind of Son of Man reference actually can also refer to what the Egyptians were doing, which was to promote ascension or an elevation of consciousness to achieve a higher state of consciousness through things like ascension chambers. I mean, the Great Pyramid has within it this, the King's Chamber, which has nothing to do with crypts for the burial of kings, but it actually had all to do with ascension, raising consciousness, frequencies, and so forth. So, could the Son of Man reference not be so much a reference to a coming Messiah for the Jews, but is a term that references more what the Egyptians were saying, someone who has elevated himself or herself in consciousness to achieve a state of purity or knowledge, which is equal to the gods or the sons of God?
Well, one of the more remarkable things about First Enoch, as I mentioned earlier, is the Christological content contained in the parables, and that content, in an astounding way, it presages the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, and it lays the substrate for much of the doctrines of the New Testament, the doctrines that are being promulgated by the apostles of Christ after his death. And so there are some, again, remarkable prophecies that directly relate to the claims of Jesus of Nazareth. It's difficult, it's impossible really to truly understand who Jesus was saying that he was without the Book of Enoch in view. I mean, we have certainly within the canonized Old Testament, we have all kinds of messianic references, and that certainly applied to this man, Jesus of Nazareth, his life and ministry. But as it pertains to the title Son of Man, that is not in the Old Testament. The title, the title Son of Man as a proper title does not appear in the Old Testament. Now, there is a verse from the book of Daniel and one in Ezekiel in which the prophets see one like a son of man in a vision, right? But this is a descriptor. It's describing a human being. In other words, they're seeing someone who looks like a human being. That title, Son of Man, never appears in the Old Testament outside of a description being used as a descriptor to describe someone that looks like a human being. However, in the book of Enoch, in First Enoch, specifically in the parables, Son of Man is a definitive title. It is a title that is being applied, and so there's a misconception here. People think that it's applied to Enoch because it said it's applied to Enoch is called Son of Man later on. Well, people are conflating that Merkaba tradition of the later sections of Enoch with the parables in the earlier sections of Enoch, what I would consider to be authentic sections of First Enoch. And it is clear that this Son of Man is a prefiguration of, it's a messianic prophecy regarding the coming Messiah, and specifically is fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth. There are statements especially there's a lot of eschatological content oracles which pertain to the end of the age that unpack, and I should say not unpack, that are foundational to claims made by Jesus of Nazareth, things that he said of himself, of the Son of Man, that would occur in an eschatological context, in other words, at the end of the age, and ideas that are then unpacked by the apostles in their formulation of eschatology. And the reason why this is important is because it's these oracles, these messianic oracles from the book of Enoch, again, specifically the parables, so clearly point to Jesus of Nazareth. I think that this is the primary reason why the book of Enoch was rejected in the canon of the Jews, because it testified of the man they had crucified. And that was the primary, in my estimation, the primary reason why it was rejected in the Jewish canon. So I would say that the Son of Man terminology, that appellation, Son of Man, rather than being, in my opinion, rather than being an indication of ascension or something like this, I think it is specific. It is a specific designation. It is a title that applies to a specific person. It was a prophetic. It was messianic prophecy that applied specifically to Jesus of Nazareth. And that becomes apparent when you compare, again, the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth and the predictions regarding him, regarding that Son of Man in the oracles of Enoch. It's very interesting that Jesus had various epithets, messianic epithets that he could have used of himself that are derived from the Old Testament, but he did not choose any of those. He referred to himself more often than not using this proper title, Son of Man, from the book of Enoch. And I find that to be highly significant. And this is part of the reason why, for example, when Jesus is standing in the home of the high priest of Caiaphas before the Sanhedrin on the night of his crucifixion, or on the eve of his crucifixion, he's standing there before the high priest, and they ask him, they interrogate him as who he claims to be. Are you the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. And then he proceeds to basically quote or reference eschatological material that's found in the book of Enoch. Yes, fragments of it, elements of it are also found in the Old Testament, but it's much more synchronistic with what's written of him in the book of Enoch. And he declares to them that he is the Son of God. And you will see, he tells them, the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tears his garments when Jesus says this. He tears his garments and accuses him of blasphemy, precisely because Jesus is identifying himself with that Son of Man from the oracles of Enoch. And if you understand how the oracles of Enoch depict that Son of Man, you can understand why Caiaphas is tearing his garments, because that Son of Man is, in the oracles of Enoch, is the great judge who would judge all flesh at the end of the age. He was the King of heaven and the very Son of God. This is all all of this is contained within the oracles of Enoch. So I would say it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I would say that the fulfillment, the primary purpose of the oracles in Enoch in regard to the Son of Man was fulfilled and culminated in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. That's how I would interpret that, and rather than it being an indication of ascension or something to that nature.
Well, I just wanted to pursue that idea of ascension in relationship to Jesus of Nazareth, because I know there's many stories about Jesus and the missing years, that he went to Egypt, that he went to the ascension schools, that he hung out with the Essenes, that he went to Tibet, learned about Buddhism, that he went to the Middle East, and he kind of learned some of the mystery traditions there. So it seems that he himself was very interested, especially in the Egyptian mystery schools and these ideas of ascension. So, and I know the Gnostic Christians kind of emphasize that Jesus was more the great teacher, showing the way, as opposed to being someone to be worshipped as a god. So you want to elaborate or comment on that?
I would say that all of these stories of Jesus going to India and learning from the great sages in Egypt, I think all of those are contrived. I don't believe that they are accurate in regard to the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. I think that they are the product, many of them, of Gnosticism, and of traditions that arose in the wake of the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. So I would not consider those traditions to be authentic in regard to their accuracy, depicting the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus going to Egypt is very symbolic. Jesus's ministry is very much mirrors the Exodus. And so Jesus going to Egypt, of course, he fled to Egypt because Herod was killing all of the toddlers in pursuit of Jesus, trying to kill Jesus in this broad genocide of all these toddlers. And Jesus's father Joseph is warned in a dream to flee to Egypt before this happens. And so this is how Jesus ends up in Egypt. And this is actually prophesied in the Old Testament, that the Messiah would come out of Egypt. It very much mirroring the deliverance of the Hebrews from the Pharaoh coming out of Egypt into the promised land, that the Messiah is going to follow this trajectory as well. So him going to Egypt, spending some time in Egypt, and then coming out of Egypt back into Israel, back into Judea, is actually a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy in regard to the Messiah. And, there's speculation that while Jesus was in Egypt, he learned from the great sages and so forth, but he wasn't in Egypt for that long. And he was very young. He was an adolescent in Egypt. We know that because by the time he gets back to Israel, there's a scene where he's in Jerusalem and his parents are there with him, Mary and Joseph, and Jesus gets lost and they can't find him and they're panicking. And long story short, they find him in the synagogue disputing with the rabbis. And Jesus is very young at this point. He's still either an adolescent or a teenager. He's very young. So he would have been a toddler in Egypt. He would have been a child in Egypt. And there's really no space in the biblical narrative for him to have gone to India and do all these different things, because by the time he gets back to Judea, he's still very young, is my point. And so I think all of this other, I would call it mythology regarding Jesus of Nazareth, was concocted in the decades and centuries following the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. There simply is no space for this kind of thing within the biblical narrative, which is attested by multiple writers. And again, is Jesus's life, his his escape to Egypt and then his coming out of Egypt to begin his ministry in Judea is foreshadowed in the Exodus. And so there is something very interesting and very dynamic about Jesus going to Egypt and living among the Egyptians for a time, certainly, but I don't think that he was learning from the great sages of Egypt how to ascend or being imbued with some kind of special knowledge during that period of time. He was, in fact, escaping the slaughter of Herod, and then returning to Judea shortly thereafter, still being an adolescent.
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting question to explore, those kind of claims of Jesus traveling to India and Egypt and Tibet and so forth. But I did want to kind of like pivot to something that I think may be relevant to what's happening today, and that is, I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen Ben Noon, who has talked about the Book of Enoch and described how it pinpoints a place in Antarctica as where the fallen angels and the watchers were taken to after they were defeated in the war with the righteous angels. And he describes a place called the Sentinel Mountains and Mount Vinson in particular in Antarctica, and says that underneath that is where these fallen angels were imprisoned for 1,000 years, and that they would eventually be freed. So is this actually relevant to today? I mean, are these fallen angels being freed? I mean, these are the Nephilim. Are they being freed? Are they going to kind of come forward and wreak havoc? What's going to happen?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just add a little bit of detail to what I had just said. Jesus was actually 12 years old. He was 12 years old according to the biblical account. So if he went to Egypt when he was 3, there wasn't very much, less than 10 years for all these supposed things to happen in his life before he went back to Judea. He was 12 years old when he was lost and found in the temple. Anyway, in regard to Antarctica and the Watchers, I have no idea. I have no idea where the Watchers were imprisoned. I mean, Peter says that they were imprisoned in Tartarus. Of course, Tartarus is a Greek word. It's a part of Greek mythology, and Tartarus, the equivalent of Tartarus in the Hebrew cosmology would be something like the realm of the dead or the abyss, something like this. And so the Watchers were in prison. They were bound in chains, according to the Book of Enoch, and imprisoned until all of the days of the world are consummated, is what the Book of Enoch says. Until the consummation of the age, the end of the consummation of the last age. Basically, all the days of the world have passed, and they're bound until the great judgment. That's what Enoch says. So I don't envision a scenario in which the Watchers are released or anything like that, although I suppose it is possible. Now, where exactly the Watchers are bound, we're operating from a position here, I certainly am, and I think you are as well, that the story, or at least elements of the story, are literally true. That these beings did descend to the earth, that they did copulate with human women, that they did progenerate hybrid entities, that the basic elements of these stories are true, and that further, that they were bound in chains and imprisoned somewhere. So I'm not approaching this topic just from a purely mythological perspective, rather from a historical perspective. So if it's true that the Watchers were here and did what we're told they did in these ancient traditions, and were bound and imprisoned somewhere, then it is possible that imprisonment, that incarceration could be somewhere on planet Earth, and in fact could be somewhere in Antarctica. Now, I'm not sure why the gentleman you're referring to believes that Antarctica specifically is where the Watchers are incarcerated, but Antarctica is definitely very interesting, to say the least. I think that, and this is just wild speculation on my part, but I think that if the ice were to melt away tomorrow in Antarctica, we would find history-changing, paradigm-shattering evidence of an advanced civilization, ancient advanced civilization, in the form of ruined temples and pyramids and who knows what else. We would find extraordinary relics from the antediluvian world. That's my feeling. That's my guess. And all it is a guess. It's just a speculation, a conjecture that beneath that ice is sort of frozen in time, the ruins, the remains, the residue, the relics of a remarkably advanced antediluvian civilization. And further, we might even discover, and perhaps have discovered, that an advanced non-human faction is still inhabiting, let's call it the inner Earth under the ice of Antarctica. I would not be surprised if that were the case.
I'll have to send you that link so that you can watch Stephen Ben Noon's
Please do.
walking through exactly where the imprisoned watchers are located in Antarctica, because I thought it was fascinating. But that kind of brings me to this kind of recent development that kind of connects to all of this, and that is that recently, just the last couple of weeks, there was a paper published by some Harvard professors that are talking about the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis, and they claimed that UFOs may not necessarily be deriving from these off-world visitors from distant exoplanets, but actually may be coming from under the Earth. So yeah, I mean, and to me, this is like a new narrative that's emerging, and it's being presented in kind of like this threat narrative that UAPs are a threat and that cryptoterrestrials are a threat. So that's a very interesting shift in narrative. So what do you think of that?
Well, this is very, very fascinating to me, and I actually had not been aware of this paper. I pulled it up when we were talking earlier, and it's interesting because when you read the beginning of the paper, the note at the beginning of the paper, it says this paper is a speculative thought piece that reflects the author's own interests and ideas and is not associated with the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. We would also like to emphasize that we believe this hypothesis to be in all likelihood false, but nevertheless believe it still merits scientific investigation. It's kind of amazing to me that they are actually saying that it merits scientific investigation, because they want to say, hey guys, we're not crazy. We think it's wrong, but we probably should look into this. So that makes me wonder, what have they seen? What sort of information have they come across that's piquing their interest here? Because this is a very bold move in regard to the security of their careers and being taken seriously by their colleagues, and that's why they put this note up front. But I actually am very sympathetic to the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. As I said earlier, it would not surprise me at all if we discovered that an advanced, or remnants of an advanced antediluvian civilization, perhaps even pre-Adamic civilization, is inhabiting the Earth somewhere, maybe in some remote location or under the Earth in some sort of a hollow Earth reality, or something else. Or, some people talk about maybe a different dimension that's parallel to the whatever the case. However, that would not indicate, it would not follow, if that's true, therefore, that these are not also extraterrestrial entities, because they might have come from somewhere else a long time ago, or they might be inhabiting the Earth, but have bases on the Earth, have habitations on the Earth or on the moon, or under the Earth, but not actually be from the Earth, be from somewhere else, but a faction of them, like colonies, are here. So I think, it doesn't necessarily negate or or it's not really in conflict with an extraterrestrial hypothesis, sort of dovetails with an extraterrestrial hypothesis from my point of view. Or it could be that they're just here and nowhere else, which would seem very strange to me. So if you have an advanced civilization that they're proposed, like the one they're proposing here in this paper, that is in possession, let's say, of these advanced aerospace vehicles, the UFO type technology, that they wouldn't be confined to the Earth. Certainly, you would imagine them also, if they're inhabiting the interior of planet Earth, why aren't they also inhabiting the interior of Mars or somewhere else? So I think that a cryptoterrestrial hypothesis, in so much as it is describing an exceedingly advanced civilization, is to some extent synonymous with an extraterrestrial civilization, because it would seem illogical to me that such a civilization would be only inhabiting the Earth if they were indeed in possession of this kind of technology. And I don't think we could assume that they're actually from the Earth.
Well, I find it very curious that all of a sudden the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis has been laid on the table as a legitimate discussion point for scientists, especially given what I have seen over the years with people such as yourself, Steve Quayle, L.A. Mazzulli, talking about the return of the Nephilim or the presence of the Nephilim, and how they are kind of associated, that they're imprisoned on the earth, and that they are located somewhere kind of like in secret places, and that would naturally lead to this cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. So is this really laying the foundations for some kind of narrative shift to all of a sudden the return of the Nephilim being something that is played up as a genuine event, that's something we should be fearful of?
I do find it very interesting, and I don't know what your position on any of this is, Michael, but I do find it very interesting that over the last decade, we have seen this concerted effort to shift the let's say the narrative away from an extraterrestrial hypothesis. I've noticed it, and I've discussed this with some of my friends like Richard Dolan, who've attested to noticing the same thing. There's been this sort of, it appears to me, an intentional shift away, this concerted effort to change the narrative from an extraterrestrial one to an interdimensional, cryptoterrestrial, ultra-terrestrial. And it's almost like maybe it's just because the extraterrestrial hypothesis is out of vogue, and these newfangled hypotheses are more interesting to people. So that's, I don't understand why that's the case, but I've certainly noticed that there is this apparent concerted effort to change the narrative. I find that rather suspicious myself, and I don't know why that would be the case exactly, but certainly would be curious as to your thoughts and position on that. But I don't know. Have you noticed the same thing?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, there's been a shift, and it's amazing just how many more people, and even the language itself, how now they're talking about non-human life forms, and they explicitly saying interdimensional beings or beings from the earth rather than extraterrestrials. So I think there's a deliberate shift in the narrative. And to me, what I think is that they've got these deep underground military bases, well over 120 that researchers have identified. Mm-hmm. And I know that in these bases that they have cloning facilities, and some of the whistleblowers have said that they've been able to develop hundreds of thousands, many thousands of cloned programmed life forms, or PLFs that they can roll out to start attacking people. And that to me would be like a great way for them to stage a false flag alien event, but it wouldn't be from space. It would be from the inner earth, and they kind of would throw in the UFO element as part of it all. But that all of a sudden you have these underground bases or facilities all over the United States or all over the planet, suddenly you're getting thousands of these programmed life forms coming out and attacking people. And there you'd have like a great justification for a kind of martial law and like just bringing about this new world order that they've been struggling to create.
Well, that's a very intriguing thought. Certainly, I've been saying for years that if, in fact, all of these underground bases exist, and I think they do, that's out of sight, out of mind, and beyond the jurisdiction of any government at that point, because you're talking about bases that are miles beneath the surface of the earth, and very few people would have clearance to go into these, to have access to these bases. The president of the United States doesn't have access to them. And a lot of them are housing special access programs, and I think our deepest, darkest secrets are kept in these underground bases. I do believe the testimony of Phil Schneider, and I do think that there are quite a few of these bases, just under America's soil, let alone bases all over the world. And if this is true, then we could have a situation in which radical genetic experimentations are taking place, again, outside of the jurisdiction of any nation or the knowledge of any politician. I mean, all bets are off if that's the case. They could be doing whatever they want. They could be doing gross, appalling cross-species genetics experimentation with animal and human life. And creating who knows what kind of monstrosities, and nobody would ever know. There could literally be an entire civilization of human beings who are born and bred underground that none of us would ever know about. And that, I mean, I know that sounds crazy to a lot of people, but if it's true that these bases exist, and if it's true that access to them is exceedingly limited, then again, this is the breeding ground for all kinds of dastardly demonic activity, as far as I'm concerned, because there's only one reason why you would want to hide the activities taking place in these bases, aside from national security concerns. It would be because they're unethical and illegal, the activity. And we know, well, here's a thought. We know millions and millions of people go missing every year from all over the world, hundreds of thousands within the United States. And Mexico go missing, just gone, disappear. Certainly tens of thousands within the continental United States every year, and nobody knows why. I mean, some of the missing persons cases have conventional explanations. They're kidnapped, sex trafficking, certainly, organ harvesting, absolutely. But it almost seems to me that there's like a systematic harvesting of the populace, and they're taking these people somewhere. And if we set aside the human trafficking, which is certainly a big part of this, and the organ harvesting, I think a lot of these people are ending up, unfortunately, in these underground bases, and are probably being subjected to some of these perhaps cloning operations, the like of which you described, or just genetic experimentation, or just maybe a slave class that exists in secret under the ground. I mean, that's a terrifying thought to me. It really is. It could be, like you said, there could be some scenario in the future that unfolds in which, I don't know, in which these clones or these genetic monstrosities emerge from these bases at some point for some sort of a false flag thing. I don't know. I mean, I guess anything's possible. If the first proposition is true, I guess anything is possible.
Well, I know that very recently the US Congress, or at least the House of Representatives, included a resolution to make the selective service system automatic for all young men from 18 to 26, because there is supposedly a need for large combat formations in the future, and that's kind of very puzzling, because the United States Air Force and the Navy, they would be the two lead agencies for fighting any kind of overseas war. So does that mean that they're seeing in the future that there will be a need for these large combat formations on US territory because of some contingency like this?
It could be something like that, or it could be an anticipation of aggression from China and Russia, World War III type scenario as well, which is also quite ominous. but in regard to our defense readiness, it's the worst I think it's ever been in our history. We're in a very precarious position now in America. Our armed forces are really at this stage pathetic. Nobody wants to join the military anymore. They've demoralized the populace, and they've spent a whole lot of time demonizing and denigrating white males, which was the primary, which constituted the primary force. And so we have a very poor readiness situation, a very dire defense readiness situation in America, and it may be that this draft is going to be a compulsory way to reinforce, to refill the ranks in our military in anticipation for World War III. I mean, my God, I think what we're doing, for example, in Ukraine is absolutely insane. Almost as if somebody behind the scenes is trying to force World War III. Is trying to force us into this open conflict with Russia and China, now North Korea. I don't know if you saw that Putin was over hanging out with Kim Jong-un over there in North Korea, and basically making a military pact, a defense pact with North Korea, that if they should engage in a conflict with the United States, North Korea is going to start firing their missiles, their nuclear missiles, their warheads at us. So we're in a very precarious situation, and my God, that's bad enough without even considering, what you're proposing, that it could be something even more surprising, a threat that we haven't even perceived that could be coming from under the ground. None of these scenarios are good.
So, given everything that you've done in terms of your research on the Book of Enoch, that kind of final days conflict, and now look at where we are as a planetary civilization, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
I'm probably both. Ultimately, because I come from a biblical worldview, as is often said, I've read the end of the book, and I'm very pleased about the way all of this culminates from a biblical perspective. But in regard to the interim between now and the very end of the age, because from the biblical perspective, the end of the book is victory, as Christ returns and vanquishes the evildoers, let's say. But in the interim, I think it's going to get very dark, and I don't know. I don't know how quickly we're going to descend into this darkness. There's so many things right now on the table that are very concerning. Not the least of which, by the way, is a scenario that I think people sometimes overlook. I'm sure you do not. This program of hybridization that's been underway for so many decades, that the Greys have been creating these, as Jacobs calls them, the hybrids, these human hybrids that are, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from human beings, that are, in Jacob's estimation, presently walking among us, a situation which is contemplated in the Cryptoterrestrial Hypothesis paper. Are these cryptoterrestrials walking among us covertly? Well, I don't know, maybe, but I do know that the hybrids of the Greys are walking, the hybrids, the advanced alien human hybrids are walking. I believe they are walking among us surreptitiously, and that is a component of everything that's developing right now that I think we should also keep in mind. So do we have, are good things going to unfold in the next decade? Very positive things for humanity, possibly, but ultimately it's hard for me not to concede to what appears to be the plain observable reality, in that we seem to be descending into some real difficult times, economic, also, as I mentioned, potential for World War III looming on the horizon. I mean, maybe another pandemic, engineered pandemic, who knows? But unfortunately, I feel like those things are more likely than not at this point. It's at some stage in the future.
So where do people go, Timothy, to get your book on the Book of Enoch? And what are you working on now? What projects do you want people to know about?
Well, the Book of Enoch is available on Amazon. So is my book, Birthright. You just type in Timothy Alberino, and you'll see both of them. I've got all kinds of interesting things underway right now, but I do have. I also want to mention I do have a members community now called the Alberino Analysis Members Community. If people want to engage with me more, see more content from me, I have, by the way, for annual subscribers, I have 3 films that I've been working on for the last several years that are included in the annual subscription, a pre-screening, private screening of these films that you can't see anywhere else. And they're full-length films, and they're really interesting. It's some of my expeditions in Peru, elongated skulls, megaliths, lost cities of the Inca. It's that sort of thing. It's sort of an adventure series. I also have some conference material that's available to annual subscribers in my members platform. There's a lot going on. I do Q&As. We have a book club feature. We're always talking about these sort of topics over there in my members community. So if you're interested in that, you can go to the alberinoanalysis.com if you want to become a member. And again, Book of Enoch, which, by the way, is a collaborative project between myself and Nate Henry and Luke Rogers from the Blurry Creatures podcast. That book of Enoch, which is my introduction and commentary, can be found on Amazon.
Well,
and also, I wanted to say, I think a conversation that would be very interesting for us to have, that sort of seems like a natural progression of this conversation, maybe at a later date, would be, I very much would like to talk to you and get your thoughts on that. I don't know if you're familiar with the Viracocha myth in Peru, in the Andes, because it ties into so much of what we're talking about here, the cryptoterrestrial idea, even the extraterrestrial components, the idea of this advanced civilization living in underground, specifically in this case in the Andes. There's a lot of interesting details there enveloped in this Viracocha mythology that I think would be very interesting for us to talk about at a later date.
I look forward to that. Well, I want to thank you, Timothy, for being on Exopolitics today and sharing all your insights and research.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.